You know, it is a really fascinating quirk of human psychology, how we visualize the internet.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we completely detach it from the physical world.
Right, like when you send a secure email or execute a high-frequency trade or just stream a documentary, the instinct is always to look up.
Yeah, we talk about our data living in the cloud.
Exactly, the cloud. We
Yeah.
just naturally imagine our digital lives kind of bouncing off satellites in the exosphere or zipping invisibly through the air around us.
It really is a brilliant bit of unintentional marketing by the tech industry,
That's sure.
because calling it the cloud implies something, well, ethereal, something untouchable and floating comfortably above the messiness of the physical world.
But the profound and honestly almost unsettling reality is that the cloud is actually incredibly heavy, and it is located at the absolute bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, it's a completely different picture when you look at the
It
logistics.
really is. I
Yeah.
mean, 95% of all international data travels along the pitch black, freezing ocean floor. The entire modern world, our whole digital existence, is held together by physical threads that are, in a lot of places, no thicker than a standard garden hose.
The contrast there is just staggering. You have the sheer volume of global commerce, which is trillions of dollars a day.
Yeah.
And it all relies on the extreme fragility of this physical infrastructure. We are talking about fiber optic cables resting thousands of meters deep,
Draped over underwater volcanic mountain ranges.
exactly spanning these vast abyssal plains. It is quite literally the lifeblood of the 21st century economy, and it's just sitting in the most hostile environment on the planet.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is zeroing in on a monumental achievement in this space, something that just hit the news cycle right now in August of 2026.
And it is a massive development for global connectivity.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this. The Australian government, working alongside a coalition of international partners, just announced something historic.
Right, the PIF announcement.
Yes. For the first time in history, every single member of the Pacific Islands Forum, or the PIF, is officially connected to the global undersea telecommunications network.
It is a staggering logistical and diplomatic milestone. I mean, when you look through the press releases from the Australian Ministry for Foreign Affairs,
Which we have right here in our source material.
yeah, and you pair that with the technical briefings from the newly established Cable Connectivity and Resilience Center, the scale of this endeavor really becomes apparent.
Because this isn't just about plugging in a router, right?
No, not at all. It is a massive reshaping of the entire regional architecture.
And we're going to look closely at those technical briefings today. Plus, we've got some really sharp strategic analysis from the United States Study Center, 9-Line, and a few academic case studies from Econstore on specific cable systems.
Because as you dig into the mechanics of this, you realize it is not a simple story of technological progress.
No, it's really not. It is a story about, well, the intense geopolitical tug-of-war that is driving all this funding.
Absolutely. And the massive friction between the governments writing the checks and the private companies that are actually laying the cables.
Right. And of course, the very real physical and political threats these cables face down in the deep ocean.
We really have to start with the sheer physical scale of the deployment, though. To connect the entire PIF, Australia partnered with Japan, New Zealand, the U.S., and Taiwan.
That is a heavy-hitting coalition.
It is. And together, they have delivered over 10,300 kilometers of new undersea cables.
10,300 kilometers.
Yeah.
Laid entirely underwater.
It is hard to even conceptualize that distance.
I know. Just to visualize that for you, you are essentially unschooling a cable from New York City all the way to Tokyo, but you're doing it while navigating oceanic trenches and, active seismic zones.
The marine engineering required for a deployment of that magnitude is punishing.
I bet.
I mean, before a single meter of cable even goes into the water, you have months of bathymetric surveys.
Which is mapping the ocean floor, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mapping it with high-resolution sonar to avoid seamounts, hydrothermal vents, and areas that are prone to underwater landslides.
Wow.
And the cable-laying ships themselves, they are highly specialized vessels that essentially function as floating dynamic positioning factories.
And these ships are laying primary cable connections that are bringing entirely new nations online for the very first time.
Right, the primary lifelines.
Yeah. We are looking at primary connections for Nauru, the Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tarawa and Kiribati, Khosrow in Micronesia, and Tuvalu.
Tuvalu is a great example, actually. They just activated the Vaca cable, which is a $56 million project funded through the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific.
$56 million for one connection.
Yeah, and the Vaca cable is a perfect example of the technical hurdles involved here. Because when you bring a cable ashore on a low-lying coral atoll like Tuvalu, you are navigating incredibly delicate reef ecosystems.
Oh, right. You can't just drag a massive cable over a coral reef.
Exactly. The ship has to hold a precise position using GPS-linked thrusters against unpredictable ocean currents.
That sounds incredibly tense.
It is. And while they are holding that position, divers and remote-operated vehicles, or ROVs, have to guide the cable through very specific pre-cleared channels to a landing station.
Just threading the needle underwater.
Yes, and then they often have to bury it under the seabed in the shallow waters just to protect it from local fishing anchors and tidal action.
And it's not just primary lifelines, right? The coalition has also laid critical secondary cables.
Yes, the redundancy lines, those are just as important.
Right. They've secured secondary connections for Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Palau, and the Solomon Islands.
Which is vital for network resilience.
But, to really grasp why this 10,300-kilometer sprint is so historic, we have to look at what these island nations were relying on before this fiber arrived.
Right, because up until very recently, many of them were completely dependent on satellite internet.
And not the fast kind we hear about today.
No, the transition from that legacy satellite infrastructure to submarine fiber is an absolute paradigm shift in physics.
How so?
Well, with satellite internet, specifically the traditional geostationary satellites that most of these nations were utilizing, you are dealing with an insurmountable physical limitation.
Distance.
Distance, exactly.
Right, because geostationary orbit is roughly 22,000 miles above the equator.
Right.
So when someone in, say, Tuvalu clicks a link on a website, that data packet has to travel 22,000 miles up to the satellite. Then 22,000 miles back down to a ground station in Sydney or wherever.
Yes.
Then the server processes their request, and the data has to make that entire 44,000-mile round trip all over again.
And look, the speed of light is incredibly fast, but it is not instantaneous.
Yeah, that is a long commute for a web page.
It really is. That 88,000-mile journey introduces severe latency. You are often looking at upwards of 600 or 700 milliseconds of delay.
Which sounds small, but in internet terms, that's an eternity.
It is unusable for modern applications. In the era of real-time cloud computing, telemedicine, and synchronous financial transactions, a 700-millisecond delay breaks the system.
Yeah, I imagine a Zoom call would be just impossible.
Oh, completely. And you combine that immense latency with highly constrained bandwidth, and running a modern national economy via geostationary satellite just becomes impossible.
It feels akin to trying to hydrate a major metropolitan city through a single drinking straw.
That is a great way to put it.
But, not even a normal straw. A straw that takes a full second for the water to reach your mouth no matter how hard you pull.
Right?
It was agonizingly slow. And worse, it was prohibitively expensive for everyday citizens.
Oh, the cost per megabit on traditional satellite backhaul is astronomical compared to fiber.
So to put this transformation in perspective, I was looking at the raw numbers from the Timor-Leste South Submarine Cable System, or the TLSC.
Ah, yes, that was just activated in July 2026.
Right? It's a 607-kilometer cable connecting Timor-Leste directly into Australia's Northwest cable system. And the leap in capacity is difficult to wrap your head around.
It really is a massive upgrade.
So the design capacity for the entire system is 27 terabits per second. And Timor-Leste's specific allocation gives them 13.5 terabits per second.
And we should probably contextualize that for the listener, right?
Yeah.
Because a terabit is 1,000 gigabits.
Yes, exactly. Which makes their baseline comparison staggering. Because before this cable was landed, the peak internet traffic for the entire country of Timor-Leste.
The whole country?
Yes, every phone, every business, every government office combined was hovering around 40 gigabits per second.
It's hard to overstate what a jump that is. Moving a nation from a ceiling of 40 gigabits to a capacity of 13,500 gigabits per second is not just an incremental upgrade.
No, it is a completely different universe.
It is an architectural revolution. When we talk about how a modern submarine cable achieves 27 terabits per second, we are looking at dense wavelength division multiplexing.
Which means what exactly in plain English?
It means they are shooting multiple different colors or wavelengths of laser light down the exact same microscopic strand of ultra-pure glass simultaneously.
Wow. So they went from the drinking straw to a massive multi-lane digital aqueduct basically overnight.
Overnight, once the splice is made, the capacity is there.
But, when you look at the sheer capital required to lay 10,300 kilometers of dense wavelength multiplexed fiber across the Pacific floor, a critical question emerges.
The financing.
Exactly. This kind of infrastructure deployment doesn't happen by accident or out of pure charity. Governments are moving with a frantic urgency right now.
Yes, they are.
So who is actually paying for all of this, and why the sudden rush to wire up the Pacific?
Well, the financing reveals the dual and sometimes competing motivations driving this whole boom.
Okay.
The public-facing motivation, the one you read in the press releases, is profound economic transformation.
Sure, development goals.
Right. But beneath that, driving the actual urgency and the unlocking of state treasuries, is an escalating great power competition.
So if we look at the economic argument first, the projections from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are massive. They model that these new connections will add over $5 billion to the Pacific's GDP.
$5 billion.
And create nearly 300,000 jobs by 2040.
And the mechanism for that GDP growth is the immediate collapse in wholesale bandwidth prices.
Just making the internet affordable.
Exactly. We can see this modeled in the academic case study from Econstore on the Papua New Guinea Coral Sea Cable System, or CS2.
Right, I read that one.
Back in 2013, before the major fiber pushes began, wholesale internet prices in PNG were just exorbitant. They were around $1,700 per megabit per second per month.
When wholesale costs are at $1,700 a megabit, you essentially don't have a digital economy.
You can't.
I mean, small businesses can't run cloud software, local farmers can't access real-time global commodity markets, and hospitals definitely can't share high-resolution diagnostic imaging.
Precisely. It bottlenecks everything. But the Econstore study noted that with the introduction of the CS2 cable, wholesale targets were projected to plummet to around $21 per megabit per second.
From $1,700 down to $21.
Yes. That collapse in the cost of data is what unlocks digital government services, distance education for remote islands, and allows a nation to diversify its economy away from physical resource extraction and into the global digital services market.
So the developmental benefits are unquestionable. It is a massive win.
Absolutely.
But looking at the United States Study Center briefs, the geopolitical reality is that Western nations aren't just suddenly writing massive checks out of pure altruism.
No, they are responding directly to China's Digital Silk Road initiative.
Right.
For the better part of a decade, Chinese state-backed telecommunications companies like HMN Tech and Huawei Marine have been aggressively expanding their footprint in developing nations.
And from what I understand, their pitch is incredibly compelling to these nations.
Oh, very. They offer turnkey, high-capacity digital infrastructure at a fraction of the cost of Western competitors.
Which raises the question of how they are underbidding Western firms so drastically. I mean, it is not just cheaper labor.
No, it is heavy state subsidies and highly integrated supply chains.
Right, because Beijing recognizes that the nation that lays the physical pipes of the 21st century internet essentially sets the standards, and they gain immense structural influence.
The strategic logic there is very clear. If you control the hardware, you have inherent visibility into the network.
Yeah.
And for a lower-income country looking at a quote from a Western consortium for, say, $100 million versus a Chinese state-backed quote for $40 million coupled with a low-interest concessional loan, the choice is purely economic.
Because affordability trumps abstract security concerns every time.
Every single time.
And this is where Australia's Pacific Step-Up policy really comes in. The U.S., Japan, Australia, and New Zealand realized they couldn't just parachute into these capitals and lecture them about the theoretical espionage risks of Chinese infrastructure.
Right, you cannot tell a developing nation, don't buy that cheap cable if you aren't willing to fund a viable alternative.
So the realization in Western capitals was that critical digital infrastructure, if it's built and maintained by foreign strategic rivals, it just poses an unacceptable vulnerability.
And the concern isn't merely espionage or data interception, though that is obviously a major factor.
Sure.
The deeper fear is political coercion.
Explain that.
Well, if a crisis erupts, the state that controls the maintenance and operational software of your telecommunications grid has immense leverage. They could theoretically degrade or throttle network performance, causing catastrophic economic disruption without firing a single shot.
Just by sending a software update. This strategic anxiety produced one of the most fascinating case studies in our stack of sources, the saga of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea with this CS2 project.
Oh, that is a perfect example of this dynamic playing out in real time.
Because back in 2017, the Solomon Islands actually awarded their international submarine cable contract to Huawei.
Yes. The initial plan was for Huawei to lay a cable connecting Honiara and Port Moresby directly into a major internet landing station in Sydney, Australia.
And the moment that contract was signed, the Australian intelligence apparatus essentially threw a massive red flag.
A huge red flag.
The prospect of a Chinese state-linked telecom company physically plugging a high-capacity cable directly into Australia's domestic telecommunications backbone was viewed as an unacceptable national security risk.
Right.
So Australia didn't just issue a diplomatic protest, they effectively bought the contract back.
They did. They stepped in and offered to fund 66.7% of an alternative $137 million project.
Which is a huge financial commitment.
It is. They brought in the Australian telecom company Vocus, partnering with Alcatel Submarine Networks to design and lay a 4,700-kilometer cable system.
So Australia covered 2/3 of the massive capital expenditure, leaving PNG and the Solomon Islands to just split the remainder.
And by doing that, they successfully boxed Huawei out of the international pipeline to Sydney.
But, and here's the detail from the EconStore report that perfectly captures the messiness of international geopolitics.
Oh, the domestic grid.
Yes, because while Australia funded that international CS2 cable, Papua New Guinea still had to build their domestic infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
The Tuvalu submarine cable network, which distributes that new bandwidth to their own coastal cities.
Right.
And how did PNG fund that domestic build? With a $270 million concessional loan from China's Exim Bank,
Yep.
and who physically built the domestic grid, Huawei.
The result is a profoundly blended, cross-subsidized network architecture.
It is wild.
Because the Western coalition successfully secured the international line and protected the Sydney landing station. But the moment that data reaches Port Moresby, it flows immediately into a domestic distribution grid financed by Beijing and built by Huawei.
I was trying to map this out in my head, and it is basically like realizing your neighborhood has a security problem. So you go out and install a military-grade biometric deadbolt on your front door.
Okay.
But then, just to save a few bucks, you let a different neighbor, who you actively suspect of spying on you, completely rebuild your back screen door and install all the internal wiring in your house.
The analogy holds up surprisingly well, actually. The data may travel securely across the ocean, but the last-mile delivery to the end user remains heavily reliant on hardware from the exact strategic rival the West was trying to edge out.
Which just shows how complicated this is.
It really does, and this fragmented outcome is exactly why the August 2026 announcement of the 10,300 kilometers of holistic network architecture is so crucial.
Because they're trying to avoid that fragmentation.
Exactly. Western governments are finally realizing they have to finance the entire ecosystem, not just the international bottlenecks.
Which brings us to a massive friction point highlighted in the USSC brief.
The public-private divide.
Yes, because governments like Australia, the US, and Japan are suddenly highly motivated to write these massive checks for geopolitical reasons. But government ministries do not own cable-laying ships.
No, they don't.
They do not manufacture optical amplifiers. They are entirely dependent on the private sector to physically execute this geopolitical strategy.
And that forced marriage between public national security goals and private commercial reality is creating serious, serious tension.
Why is it so tense?
Well, the tension is rooted in a fundamental transformation of the submarine cable industry over the last decade. Historically, if you look back to the 1990s and early 2000s, these cables were built and owned by massive consortiums of national telecommunications companies.
Like AT&T, British Telecom, Telstra, companies like that.
Exactly.
But the USSC brief points out that the telecom consortium model is pretty much dead. Today, 66% of global undersea cable capacity is being driven and purchased by the hyperscalers.
Yes. The data demands of companies like Meta, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft have scaled so aggressively that they are no longer just leasing capacity on telecom cables.
Right.
They are designing, funding, and wholly owning their own transoceanic systems. They need massive proprietary pipes to sync their global data centers.
So when the U.S. State Department or the Australian Foreign Ministry tries to steer the deployment of submarine cables for geopolitical leverage, they aren't just negotiating with traditional telecoms anymore.
Not at all.
They are trying to herd tech behemoths whose market capitalizations often exceed the GDP of the actual nations they're connecting.
And those private companies have three very distinct, very vocal grievances regarding government intervention in their sector.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first is a profound lack of aligned vision. From the private sector's perspective, government involvement often feels entirely ad hoc and reactive.
How so?
Well, a government will announce a sudden $50 million grant solely to block a Chinese bid without any overarching decade-long strategy for commercial viability or regional connectivity.
They are essentially complaining that governments are playing geopolitical whack-a-mole rather than acting as serious commercial partners.
That is exactly how they see it. And the second major complaint is the regulatory nightmare of poor domestic and international coordination.
Because laying a submarine cable requires navigating an incredibly dense thicket of international maritime law.
Oh, it is a legal labyrinth.
Yeah.
You're dealing with exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, environmental impact assessments, and domestic telecommunications regulations.
Right, so if a private company is laying a cable from Sydney to Tokyo, they might have to secure environmental permits for coral reef protection in one jurisdiction,
Yes,
and then get cybersecurity clearance in another and maritime seabed leasing rights in a third.
exactly. And the industry is saying to the governments, if you want us to build these geopolitical lifelines, you have to streamline your own internal bureaucracies first.
The regulatory friction is just immense.
It is. But the third and perhaps most critical complaint from the private sector is the desperate need for policy stability.
Policy stability.
Yes, because the life cycle of a submarine cable project, from the initial desktop study and marine surveys to manufacturing, laying, and the final splice, that can take 3 to 5 years.
And once active, the asset is engineered to operate for 25 years.
Exactly.
And governments operate on 2, 3, or 4-year election cycles.
Right. So if I am a private consortium looking at a $500 million capital expenditure, I am terrified that a new administration will come into power halfway through the build.
And arbitrarily change the rules.
Yes, change the national security requirements regarding which optical components I can use, or just simply pull the grant funding altogether.
We saw a really clear manifestation of this public-private friction with Australia's massive acquisition of Digicel Pacific.
Yes, that is a textbook example.
Because Digicel is the dominant mobile network operator across several key Pacific Island nations. And in 2021, credible reports emerged that a Chinese state-linked telecom firm was preparing to purchase Digicel Pacific.
So once again, the Australian government steps in to block the move.
Right. They essentially bankrolled a $2 billion acquisition of Digicel Pacific by the Australian telecom giant Telstra. $2 billion.
It was described as Australia's largest ever single foreign policy investment.
And this is exactly where the private sector critique sharpened, right?
Very much so. Within telecommunication circles, some viewed this massively expensive acquisition as little more than strategic virtue signaling.
Because buying the corporate entity, like buying the brand and the holding company, doesn't magically change the physical hardware that has actually transmitted the data.
Precisely. While the Telstra acquisition prevented a Chinese buyout of the corporate entity, it did not immediately rip and replace the presence of Chinese hardware from the region.
The actual cell towers and stuff.
Right. Vendors like ZTE and Huawei were already deeply embedded in the radio access network, the cell towers, and local infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, it is important to note that under Telstra's ownership, Digicel is actively moving to replace that legacy gear with Nokia infrastructure.
Okay, so they are fixing it.
They are. But the private sector's point was that spending $2 billion on corporate restructuring is an incredibly inefficient way to secure a network if the physical architecture remains unchanged for years.
Which brings up a strategic dilemma that I find genuinely concerning.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah. If governments in Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra enact strict policies that effectively ban their domestic tech companies from partnering with Chinese cable operators, companies like HMN Tech,
Yeah,
how does that actually play out globally?
that is the big question.
Because if we tell Western firms they cannot co-invest or share infrastructure with Chinese firms, don't we just incentivize those Chinese companies to go out and build their own parallel, entirely isolated systems?
Yes.
By trying to isolate them, aren't we accidentally accelerating the bifurcation of the internet into two separate, completely untrusted spheres?
That is a highly sophisticated read on the situation, and it perfectly mirrors the private sector's primary warning to policymakers.
Really?
Yes, the industry is desperately trying to convey the commercial realities of the global market to national security officials. If Western governments overregulate and prohibit any commercial engagement, they effectively ban American, Australian, and Japanese firms from bidding on vast swaths of telecommunications projects in the developing world.
Which leaves a massive vacuum.
Exactly.
And Chinese system suppliers can just walk right into those markets without facing any competitive bids from the West, allowing them to establish total dominance in emerging economies.
You nailed it. The private sector argues that by attempting to aggressively suppress a foreign competitor through blanket bans, Western governments might inadvertently catalyze their expansion.
That is wild to think about.
A bifurcated internet, where data hits a hard border between Western-built infrastructure and Chinese-built infrastructure, is a worst-case scenario for global commerce.
So what does the industry want?
The industry advocates for a more calibrated approach, maintaining enough commercial engagement to ensure Western companies keep a foothold and vital visibility within these emerging networks, rather than forcing a total opaque partition.
It is a dizzying strategic tightrope. But let's ground this back in the physical reality of the ocean.
Okay, let's go back underwater.
Yeah, because even if the governments and the hyperscalers perfectly align their strategies and smoothly navigate the geopolitical friction to get the cable into the water, they are still dropping it into an incredibly hostile environment.
The deep ocean is arguably the most unforgiving environment on the planet for critical infrastructure.
It really is.
You are dealing with immense hydrostatic pressure, highly corrosive saltwater, seismic instability, and completely unpredictable marine geology.
And the vulnerability of these island nations to natural disasters is terrifying, especially when they only have a single cable connecting them to the rest of the planet.
Right, the single point of failure.
The Tonga eruption in 2022 is just the ultimate case study in systemic fragility.
The January 2022 eruption of the Tonga Hapai volcano was a cataclysmic geological event.
Unprecedented.
But the damage to the infrastructure wasn't just from the surface explosion or the resulting tsunami. The eruption triggered massive underwater avalanches known as turbidity currents.
Turbidity currents.
Yes, they are dense, extremely fast-moving currents of sediment and rock tearing down the continental slope.
And those underwater avalanches completely severed Tonga's sole international submarine cable, as well as their domestic inter-island cable.
Instantly.
The entire country was instantly plunged into a digital blackout. No internet, no international phone lines. They were entirely cut off from the global financial system, right in the middle of a massive humanitarian crisis.
And the repair logistics for an event like that are just grueling.
How do you even fix a cable miles underwater?
Well, first you have to dispatch a specialized repair vessel, which might be thousands of miles away at the time.
Right.
Once on site, the ship deploys ROVs or drags heavily engineered grapnels along the ocean floor to locate the severed ends of the cable.
So they're basically dragging a massive hook through the pitch-black abyss, just hoping to snag a garden hose buried in volcanic mud.
That is exactly what they are doing, and once they snag it, they have to haul it to the surface, which places immense mechanical tension on the cable.
It's amazing it doesn't just snap again.
Well, sometimes it does. Then, on the deck of a pitching ship, highly specialized technicians have to strip back the polyethylene and steel armor, clean the microscopic glass fibers, and execute a fusion splice.
Melting the glass together.
Yes, melting the glass together with absolute precision to ensure optical continuity. And then they seal it all in a massive titanium joint housing and lower it back down to the seabed.
That is incredible.
It took weeks to restore Tonga's connectivity.
And just as the country was recovering and stabilizing, a major earthquake in 2024 severed their domestic line again.
It really just perfectly illustrates why the redundancy built into this new 10,300-kilometer initiative is so critical.
Right. A major piece of this August milestone was the activation of the 383-kilometer Hawaii-Tonga cable, funded jointly by Australia and New Zealand.
Yes, that finally provides Tonga with a second physically diverse international connection.
Because redundancy is really the only true defense against the geology of the Pacific.
Exactly. By landing a second cable that takes an entirely different geographic route to a major trans-Pacific trunk line, you ensure that a single localized seismic event doesn't erase an entire sovereign nation from the digital map.
But underwater avalanches and earthquakes are indiscriminate. They do not have political agendas.
No, they don't.
Human threats, however, are highly targeted. And this leads us to the 9-line strategic brief analyzing Taiwan and the escalation of gray zone tactics.
Yes, submarine cables have quietly become a primary battleground for gray zone warfare.
So for the listener, what exactly is gray zone warfare?
Gray zone warfare is a concept that dominates modern strategic thinking. It refers to aggressive, state-backed actions that are intentionally calibrated to sit in the ambiguous space between normal diplomatic competition and an overt act of war.
So just annoying enough to cause damage, but not enough to start a war.
Precisely. The goal is to coerce, disrupt, exhaust, or blind an opponent using tactics that fall just below the threshold that would trigger a conventional military response or invoke mutual defense treaties.
And the incidents surrounding Taiwan over the last few years are textbook examples of this ambiguity, aren't they?
Absolutely. In early 2023, a Taiwanese cable near the remote Dongyan Island was severed.
And initially, it might have looked like poor weather displacing underwater wreckage.
Right, but when you look at the pattern of other incidents in the region, a very different picture emerges.
Because Taiwanese authorities have documented multiple incidents involving highly suspicious maritime behavior.
Yes. In one notable case, a foreign registered vessel, operated by a corporate entity based in Hong Kong but crewed entirely by Chinese nationals, intentionally disabled its tracking systems.
Okay.
And then it subsequently dragged its anchor directly across the path of the Trans-Pacific Express cable.
And that is not an isolated tactic. There was a Mongolia-flagged ship involved in an attempted cable disruption, right?
Yes.
And a Togo-flagged vessel, the Hongtai 58, was directly linked to severe damage on a critical domestic cable running between Taiwan's main island and the Penghu archipelago.
What's fascinating here is the methodology. It is deeply cynical and highly effective.
How so?
These vessels utilize flags of convenience. They register the ship in nations with lax maritime oversight, like Togo or Mongolia, to obscure the true ownership.
Right.
Then they intentionally disable their automatic identification system, or AIS.
Now, AIS is the global tracking system that broadcasts a ship's position, course, and speed, right? It is fundamental for maritime safety to prevent collisions.
Correct. By turning off the AIS, the vessel essentially goes dark. They then navigate over well-mapped, publicly known submarine cable corridors and drop their massive anchors, allowing them to drag along the seabed.
Just ripping up whatever is down there.
Exactly. When the anchor inevitably snags and snaps the fiber optic cable, the vessel powers back up, and the operators simply claim it was a navigational error, a sudden loss of engine power, or bad weather.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of a hit and run in a dark alley.
That is a very accurate way to look at it.
I mean, you are lying on the ground with broken infrastructure. You know exactly what make and model of car hit you, and you have a very strong suspicion about who ordered the driver to do it.
Right.
But because they took the license plates off and there were no security cameras, you cannot definitively prove it in a court of international law without risking a major escalation.
And that lack of definitive proof is the core mechanism of gray zone coercion. As the 9-line brief emphasizes, the physical damage to the cable is actually secondary.
Right.
Yes, the true strategic weapon is the ambiguity.
Because that ambiguity forces the victim government into an impossible dilemma.
Exactly.
If an island's connectivity goes dark, the domestic political pressure is immense. The banking system halts, emergency services are degraded, the economy bleeds millions of dollars a day.
The public naturally demands an immediate response.
Right. But if a government angrily points the finger at a strategic rival and threatens retaliation without ironclad, publicly verifiable proof, they risk sparking an accidental kinetic war over what the aggressor insists was merely a clumsy fishing boat.
The aggressor artificially constructs a political crisis where the victim is trapped. If the victim retaliates without proof, they are branded as the aggressor escalating a maritime accident into a war.
Which is exactly what they want to avoid.
But conversely, if the victim does nothing, absorbs the economic damage, and just quietly dispatches a repair ship, they establish a dangerous precedent.
They signal to the aggressor that this tactic is cost-free and highly effective, practically inviting further sabotage. So how on earth do you counter a threat that operates with plausible deniability at the bottom of the ocean? I mean, you can't put a naval destroyer above every mile of cable.
No, you can't.
And as we discussed, you can't stop a volcano from erupting.
The only viable solution seems to be engineering extreme, multi-layered resilience into the system itself.
Resilience.
Yes, resilience is the dominant paradigm in current strategic circles. The assumption is no longer that you can prevent every cable cut.
Okay.
The assumption is that cables will be cut, and the architecture must be designed to absorb the blow and recover instantly.
So how do they do that?
This resilience requires a three-pronged approach: robust regional governance, shared physical repair capacity, and independent technological backups.
Let's unpack the governance and protection layer first, because the sources place heavy emphasis on the newly established Cable Connectivity and Resilience Center, or the CCRC.
Yes, this was a major initiative launched by Australia, and it is heavily backed by the Quad.
The Quad being the strategic security dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States.
Right. The CCRC is essential because they are executing the highly unglamorous, bureaucratic, on-the-ground work required to harden this infrastructure.
What kind of work?
For example, the reports detail a recent Talanoa held in Tonga under the CCRC's auspices.
Now, a Talanoa is a traditional Pacific concept, right?
Yeah.
A framework for inclusive, transparent dialogue and consensus building.
Yes, exactly. The CCRC utilized this framework to bring together government ministries, private cable operators, and local ocean management agencies to negotiate and establish formal cable protection zones.
Which means moving beyond just, drawing a line on a map.
Oh, absolutely. They are drafting actual local legislation that legally protects the specific seabed corridors where the cables are laid.
I see.
It legally restricts deep-sea trawling, dredging, or dropping anchor within those precise coordinates. This creates a legal framework to prosecute vessels that accidentally drag their anchors through the zone.
Because if you drop anchor in a legally protected zone, it was an accident excuse doesn't hold up in court.
Exactly. It removes some of that gray zone ambiguity.
That is smart. And beyond legislation, the CCRC is funding vital regional capacity building, right?
Yes. They recently sponsored a comprehensive knowledge exchange study tour.
Tell me about that.
Well, the Solomon Islands Submarine Cable Company, which has gained several years of hard-won operational experience managing the CS2 system, they actually hosted technical representatives from Nauru and Tuvalu.
So they are teaching the nations that just got their very first cables how to actually manage them.
Yes. They are sharing protocols on monitoring optical power levels to detect potential tampering, scheduling maintenance, and understanding the logistics of retaining repair vessels on standby.
It creates a baseline of technical competence across the entire region.
It does. But governance also addresses a more insidious threat, which is corruption.
Right.
The Econstore case study on the PNG cable highlights a brilliant structural detail here. The CS2 project was governed jointly by Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands through a multilateral entity called the Coral Sea Cable Company.
And that joint governance structure forced the entire project to adhere to the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, or the cost-piece standards.
Exactly.
Because by bringing multiple nations into the ownership and management structure, you essentially bypass the risks of political interference, cronyism, or opaque procurement processes that can fatally undermine massive infrastructure projects in developing nations.
It establishes a framework of bounded accountability. Everyone is watching everyone else's books.
Yeah.
But from a geopolitical security perspective, multilateral ownership provides an even greater benefit, which is shared attribution.
I see where this is going.
Yeah.
Because if a state-backed vessel cuts a cable that is solely owned by Taiwan, the aggressor is only managing a bilateral diplomatic dispute with Taipei.
Exactly.
But if they sever a cable system that is jointly owned and governed by Taiwan, the United States, Australia, and Japan, well, the calculus changes entirely.
Precisely. By multilateralizing the ownership of the physical infrastructure, you drastically alter the risk calculus for the saboteur. Cutting that cable no longer provokes a single, isolated nation. It instantly triggers a coordinated response from a massive multilateral coalition.
It raises the threshold of deterrence.
It does.
But even with cable protection zones, cost standards, and multilateral deterrence, we know the reality. Cables will still break.
They will.
A ship will inevitably drop an anchor during a typhoon, or a turbidity current will sweep down a trench. Which brings us to the technological backup layer.
The satellites.
Right. This was a massive topic of debate at the recent PITA conference, the Pacific Islands Telecommunications Association, held in Rarotonga.
Right.
The CCRC presented major research there regarding low Earth orbit, or ELA satellite constellations.
We are talking about highly advanced, low-latency systems like Starlink or OneWeb.
Yeah, and it is absolutely vital to clarify the technical dynamic here, which the CCRC report does quite explicitly. LEO satellites are not a replacement for undersea fiber optic cables.
It is a huge public misconception.
It really is. People see Starlink dishes popping up globally and assume physical cables are obsolete technology.
It is a violation of physics, frankly. Fiber optic cables remain the absolute lowest cost, highest capacity backbone of global connectivity.
Because light is just better than radio waves.
Yes. The physics of transmitting multiplexed light through ultra-pure glass will always offer exponentially superior bandwidth and lower latency than converting data into radio frequency, blasting it through atmospheric interference to a satellite moving at 17,000 miles an hour and relaying it back down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A single modern fiber pair can carry more data than an entire constellation of LEO satellites. However, LEO satellites are the ultimate flexible redundancy.
They are the digital equivalent of a massive, instantly deployable backup generator.
Perfect analogy. When the Tonga volcano severs the physical fiber, LEO satellite terminals can be activated within hours to restore critical emergency communications.
Which is a lifesaver.
Literally. Furthermore, they are the only economically viable way to extend baseline connectivity to the most remote, sparsely populated outer islands that will simply never generate the economic demand to justify a $50 million dedicated cable spur.
And if we tie this technological reality back to the geopolitical strategy, having a robust LEO satellite redundancy layer buys policymakers the one resource they are completely starved of during a gray zone crisis.
Time.
Because if a hostile actor severs an island's cable, but the LEO satellite network instantly kicks in to keep the hospitals functioning, the ATMs dispensing cash, and the government command and control networks online, the immediate visceral panic subsides.
Exactly. The domestic economy doesn't enter a total freefall. The public isn't rioting in the dark.
And that stability gives intelligence agencies and maritime investigators the breathing room they need.
Yes. They have the time to track historical AIS data, task reconnaissance satellites to review orbital imagery, and meticulously determine whether the cable cut was a genuine maritime accident or a coordinated gray zone attack.
It prevents a democratic government from being forced into a hasty, potentially catastrophic military escalation by a panicked, disconnected public.
It takes the temperature down.
So, looking at the entire scope of this August 2026 milestone, it is so much more than just a telecommunications upgrade.
Oh, absolutely.
The 10,300 kilometers of new fiber laid across the Pacific isn't just about unlocking high-definition streaming or cheaper cellular plans for the PIF members.
No, it is the physical manifestation of a massive geopolitical chess match.
Yeah.
It is an economic lifeline strategically engineered to pull developing nations securely into the global digital market, while simultaneously denying strategic rivals a monopoly over the region's critical architecture.
It is the unseen, vulnerable frontier of the modern world, and maintaining it, as we have seen today, requires a relentless, agonizingly delicate balance between national security imperatives, the profit-driven realities of private tech giants, and the sheer unpredictable violence of the ocean itself.
And the complexity of managing that balance is only going to accelerate as our dependence on this submerged infrastructure deepens.
Which leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought to leave you with.
Okay.
As nations increasingly recognize these private commercial glass threads as sovereign military assets and critical national infrastructure, what happens to the ocean floor itself?
That is a great question.
Because for centuries, the deep ocean, the abyssal plains and trenches, has been treated under maritime law as an international commons, a vast shared space belonging to no one and everyone. But if the very survival of our global economy, our militaries, and our digital society depends entirely on protecting these fragile physical corridors, will we see a future where the seabed itself is partitioned, claimed, and heavily militarized to protect the invisible light that keeps our world alive?
It is a profound and unsettling question. We may very well be in the early stages of witnessing the enclosure and militarization of the last great physical frontier on Earth.
A frontier where the entirety of the 21st century hangs by a thread thinner than a garden hose. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible architecture of our world. We will catch you next time.